you're quite distant, so if anyone would like to move forward to the front, then please do. And then people who come in at the back through the event can find seats. But for now, just a very warm welcome from me. I'm Caris Roberts, and I'm Executive Director at the IPPR. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this event today, which is Building Back Better, Regional Inequality and the Recovery. The event's hosted by IPPR's Centre for Economic Justice, which is our initiative to look at how we can create an economy that is both prosperous and just. You'll find some of these reports around, which is our latest report looking at how we can build back an economy that is stronger and works for everybody. And you'll be hearing a bit more about it from George Dibb, who leads the centre today. In terms of a few bits of housekeeping, so we do have Slido. So if you want to ask any questions but you don't want to put your hand up, feel free to do that. And similarly, if you're watching online, then you can use Slido in the app. But also do be thinking of questions in the room. So I want to make as much time as possible for questions and audience discussion. So consider that your warning. In terms of today, so we're going to hear from George. George is Associate Director at IPPR and Head of the Centre for Economic Justice. We're going to be hearing from Councillor James Jamieson, who's a Central Bedfordshire Councillor and Chairman of the Local Government Association. We'll be hearing from Richard Holden MP, who's MP for North West Durham and has been since 2019. We'll be hearing from Margaret Bolton, Director of Policy and Communications at Local Trust. And we'll be hearing from Martin Tugwell, Chief Executive of Transport for the North. So a really great panel for us to get into this topic today. We'll be thinking about the government's Building Back Better agenda, but also specifically the Levelling Up agenda. So we've heard from Michael Gove today about the key constituent parts of that, and I'm looking forward to discussing that with the panel. For us, that has to think about how places can be empowered to fully grasp local economic opportunities and to revitalise communities after the pandemic. And so that's why I'm delighted that we've got both a central government and a local government perspective on the panel today. For now, I'm going to hand over to George to tell you a bit about our latest work on this.
Thank you. And thank you, Caris, for the introduction. So I won't speak for very long, so I'm also eager really to get into the Q&A. I'm sure there's going to be lots of really interesting questions from the audience today. As Caris said, the report, which you'll find floating around in the room, Prosperity and Justice After the Pandemic, is the IPPR Centre for Economic Justice's view on how the UK government can build back better and help the UK recover from the COVID pandemic. Our position is that the economy needs to be hardwired for justice and fairness, and that there were structural problems with the economy pre-COVID, which we saw manifesting in a variety of ways, but that actually the pandemic, the economic shock and the shock to people's lives and livelihoods has exacerbated and made some of those problems worse, and that a fair recovery and building back better means remedying those fairness issues. The report is really dense and it makes a range of points across the areas of the business sector, the world of work, and wealth inequality. But the thing that we're here to talk about today is around regional inequality and how the UK government can contribute to levelling up. Just a couple of points on how the pandemic has actually been specifically seen or exacerbated challenges of regional inequality. The pandemic or the virus itself affected different places in many different ways. We know that factors as varied as poverty, household overcrowding, as well as ethnic background play a huge role in determining the spread of the virus and also its, how deadly it can be. So the spread of the virus itself was determined by levels of economic deprivation. Those places that were poorest pre-pandemic had a worse pandemic purely on terms of the virus itself. We also know that, of course, people's livelihoods were significantly changed primarily through the world of work and how their work was impacted. Places which were more economically deprived pre-pandemic were more likely to have local economies or jobs which were based upon in-person work, and therefore those places were more likely to have seen larger economic shocks through the pandemic because people were less likely to be able to pivot to working from home. So just a comparison between the borough of Richmond in London, where 72% of people were able to pivot to working from home, compared to Middlesbrough, where 17% of people were able to pivot to working from home. That split on a regional basis had very stark implications for people's lives. And then finally, on a recovery point and the ability of those places to bounce back and recover, places which were more economically deprived pre-pandemic were more likely to have skills gaps or lower levels of educational attainment, which was likely to hinder their ability to recover. So we can see that the pandemic has affected regional inequality and has been quite stark in the way it's done so. We make a whole range of recommendations in the report about ways that we can contribute to building back better and the way the government can contribute to building back better. The primary agenda of levelling up is absolutely a critical one, given what we've seen, and we make two headline recommendations of how that can be achieved. First and foremost, we note that not only is the UK one of the most economically divided countries in the world, it's also one of the most centralised countries in the world in terms of its decision-making. Decision-making power is overwhelmingly held in Whitehall and in Westminster, and to actually enable the levelling up agenda that the government has so rightly put at the top of its economic programme, powers should be shifted from Westminster and Whitehall on tax and spend across a whole range of different policy areas to local regions. Second, levels of investment on a per capita basis are significantly lower outside London and the South East, and it's important that we uplift funding to areas outside London and the South East based on a fair and transparent formula. Currently, whether you're based in London, a borough of London, or a borough here in Manchester, both have to bid to the Treasury for a Towns Fund or Levelling Up Fund pots of money. And that means that it requires a whole range of hurdles, and they're not given the funding that would enable them to fix their own problems in ways that they know how. I'll wrap up just shortly, but one other kind of provocation which I'd like to just pick up and dwelling on Michael Gove's speech today. I worked quite a lot with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy over the past few years, and under the Prime Minister Theresa May, industrial strategy was the primary economic development programme of the government, and the main power struggle within Whitehall was between Bayes, who wanted to invest in industrial strategy and innovation, and the Treasury that wanted to hold that, to think about fiscal restraint. I think that is likely to be seen again under this government, where the main economic development programme of this government is levelling up, and that the new Department for Levelling Up under the leadership of Michael Gove is likely to face some of the same challenges that Bayes did under Theresa May. So the Centre for Cities has put a price tag on levelling up of the UK at the same level as German unification, and that was in today's prices that would approximately be about £2 trillion. The ability to actually put the investment needed behind the policy programme will probably be a major challenge. I think whether the Deluxe, I've heard people calling it, or the Department for Levelling Up will be able to kind of grab that investment power and actually invest to make it a reality is going to be a main question. So really interested to know what you in the room and other people on the panel think about making that a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. James, over to you for your comments.
Thank you very much, and George has stolen half of my notes already, but I'll try and sound a little bit differently. We all know that there's huge inequalities across the UK, both north, south, east, west, but even on a local basis. So, you can take even my area in central Bedfordshire, where, if I take the most deprived ward, which is among the most 10% deprived in the country, and compare it to the wealthiest ward, I get the same differences in terms of life expectancy and everything else. So it isn't just a north-south divide, is one point I would make. And I do think the pandemic, as you said, has really not just crystallised, highlighted those differences and really highlighted the issues that we have in many parts of the country. What it's also demonstrated, the pandemic, is just how good local government can be if we're given the chance. So if we look at things like the rough sleeping initiative, all those rough sleepers brought in across the country because government decided to work with local government, work with local voluntary groups and deliver something, and maybe worry a little bit less about bidding for something. It was about achieving an outcome, which was getting rough sleepers in. In the same way, when we're talking about protecting the medically vulnerable, the 2 million early on in the pandemic, You know, once government realised it was difficult, they reached out to local government to actually help solve the problem. In the same way, things like test and trace, you know, when local government started getting involved in that, we were just delivering much better outcomes in terms of getting money to businesses. Again, local government could do it. So there has been a much more open engagement with government and other public bodies and the NHS in this pandemic, and we really want that to continue because we demonstrated we can do it. And that really comes to my point of you cannot deliver levelling up by Whitehall. The 19 or 20 or however many departments there are in Whitehall cannot work out what is needed on the ground in Middlesbrough or in central Bedfordshire or in Truro or wherever. That can only be done at the local level. That's how you do it effectively and efficiently. It is about what is right for my community, what is right for my place, and how can I deliver that. It is not about government deciding from 200 plus miles away. However, government does have a very important role to do because it can enable that. It can give local government not only the resources and the devolved powers, but also the tools we need to deliver those things. And that's all about trust. And I've changed my tune. I don't think government should trust councils. I think they should trust local electors, because local electors vote for MPs, but they also vote for local councils. And if we're no good, they should vote us out. And, you know, so trust councils, and by implication, trust local electors to hold councils to account. You cannot hold quangos to account, and there are far too many quasi-quangos in this country where we don't have real local accountability. And then, you know, we were saying the issue of 2 trillion. I don't think levelling up requires 2 trillion. It requires, the most important thing is the most effective use of the money that we do have available. And local government, time and time again, has demonstrated it is more effective at using money than Whitehall departments, because we tend to talk to our communities and we tend to work across local government. And I think that's really important. And also, levelling up is not just about infrastructure. It's not about a new motorway or HS2 or whatever. It's about far, far more. You know, you need to think about devolution of the planning system. At the moment, local councils are implementers of the planning system. We don't have a properly devolved planning system with local decisions. It's about the economy and jobs, and how can you pass more of those levers onto a local level. And sometimes that'll be a council, and sometimes that'll be a combined authority. Health. If we're really going to have better health across the country, we need to focus on community health, preventative health, giving people good housing, reducing pollution. It's great having a state-of-the-art hospital nearby, but personally, I'd rather never need that hospital. And much better is, how do you improve people's health and keeping them out of hospital? And by the way, that's a lot cheaper in the long run. It's about skills. I have been banging the drum with government for the last 6 or 7 years about truck drivers, saying, why on earth are we funding media studies, hairdressing, beauticians courses to a level far in excess of the local market need, and yet we can't find a way of spending a few £1,000s training people to be a truck driver, a forklift truck driver, and so forth. I think we've had a crisis. They might actually listen now. You know, having local decision making about says, these are the jobs that are needed in my area. We've talked to the businesses. There are jobs there. Let's, you know, focus the money that is available on that, and not on what is the cheapest course to run at my local FE college, that there's enough people to fill it. You know, these courses may be more expensive. We may not be able to offer as many, but if they get a job, and a quality job at the end of it, really important. There's a huge amount of public assets across this country. You know, I used to have long, hippie-ish hair about 10 years ago when I first started in local government, trying to work with the NHS, highways, Network Rail to release assets to either create jobs or build houses is nigh on impossible. There needs to be something that says, in a local area, there must be a presumption, if there's a surplus asset, that the local community, and by that I mean council, can use it for the betterment of that community. And it is also about leveraging the public pound. You know, it's not just about, you know, building a council house or investing in a piece of infrastructure. It's about, Well, how many apprenticeships can I get out of that? How many local businesses can I support in that by sourcing locally? So leveraging the public pound, really important. And we come to, how do we square the circle of levelling up the country but not denuding the south of investment? Well, one is the south has a very valuable land, and most of that money goes to farmers and developers and land promoters. We need to extract that value where there is that value to deliver the infrastructure in the south. That means you can focus more of government funding on those areas where actually there isn't that land value and where you do need to support brownfield sites which may be contaminated. You need to focus on outcomes. I mean, the number of times we bid for something and it's all about, can you fit in with this process? When actually, what's your objective? We want more people who've been unemployed for 12 months to be in work. We want more houses delivered. We want a healthier community. So that's the outcome. Fund things on the basis of the outcome rather than a beauty parade on a process. And finally, local government is the most effective and efficient form that we have in the public sector. So the more you spend with local government, the more you enable local government to deliver, the better the outcomes will be wherever you are in the country.
Thank you very much, James, for those thoughtful remarks. I'll turn now to Richard.
Thank you very much indeed. I know there's a big question at the moment, really. Shall I take a still microphone? I think there's a big question at the moment, a lot about what will happen post-pandemic. And the key thing is, and I think the Prime Minister's started to enunciate this a little bit, and we'll hear more on Wednesday, but at the moment there's the Build Back Better phrase, but I think it encapsulates an idea which is quite important, which is that what was there before cannot be there again. And I think that's what levelling up means too. I know we need a bit more meat on the bone of some of these ideas, but for me it means three things. First of all, it means public services which can deliver better outcomes, and I'll come on to a little bit more detail about these three in a moment. Secondly, it means good jobs, and that means jobs which lead to careers. And thirdly, it means infrastructure, but in a broad sense of enabling access to both better jobs, education, and some of those public services. I think before the pandemic, we had, and actually before this government, we'd had a sort of accepted politics for probably both the New Labour and the recent Conservative and the Thatcher period of pumping money into these areas in order just to keep them afloat. I think before then we'd had an idea of pumping money in these areas to sort of manage their decline. And what I think the real challenge, the real test for levelling up is not actually if it's something which just happens now or is a catchphrase or even gets me re-elected, is if the real test will be if it's something that both the mainstream parties adopt essentially as an economic policy for the next 20 or 30 years. By infrastructure, I mean the issue in many of my communities is their access to so many different things. You can't actually get across many parts of my constituency. I've got no dual carriageway, I've got no motorway, I've got no railway. This isn't a massive bid for huge amounts of public money for massive infrastructure projects, but it is about ensuring that people can get realistic bus access to the local town in order to be able to get job opportunities or indeed education opportunities. I think whether it's Andy talking about what's been happening in Manchester or it was Boris talking about what was happening in London, it's about accessibility to those jobs and education opportunities for young people so that they don't feel the need to move away in order to move on with their lives. In terms of public services, one thing that's particularly struck me since becoming Member of Parliament is just the difficulty of not just recruitment but retention of more experienced staff in the public sector. We have real problems in North West Durham but more broadly across the north of England, in the poorer parts of the north of England, of retaining those really good teachers and also filling those NHS vacancies. Those health inequalities and then those educational inequalities are then mutually reinforcing, again driving driving people away and creating a negative spiral. So I think levelling up means trying to create a positive spiral in those public services. And I think the third thing, as I said before, is around careers and good jobs. One of the biggest challenges I face in my constituency is youth unemployment. My actual employment rate overall is around the national average, but my youth unemployment rate is double the national average. And one of the main issues with that is young people getting access to their first jobs, which takes you back to entirely that infrastructure point. If they can't get access to other areas which are growing, or other parts of the northeast, you've seen huge amounts of announcements recently about jobs across the region. Then they're not going to be able to stay where they grew up, and they're not even able to access those jobs in other areas. So we're facing this particularly difficult element to it. And I'd just like to pick up on something that James said actually, which was around FE. And I think this is probably one of the most important things that the government needs to look at as we try and build back better out of the pandemic. And that's, we need courses which enable people to go on after 16 and earn money and contribute to their communities and society. We shouldn't be ramming people into excessive numbers of hair and beauty courses. There will always be a requirement for that, but you know, I worked in the Department of Education and I am now on the Public Accounts Committee, and looking at some of the way in which colleges are funded, it's just not acceptable that we're pushing people into areas and down onto courses which aren't going to deliver those outcomes that they need for the long term. It's also unacceptable that we're pushing people towards universities and to courses which, for around 25% of them, aren't going to leave them better off afterwards. I think there's much better opportunities if we can work with local firms to really enable them to help their local economies thrive. I'd also agree on the uncontrolled quangos element. On my recent work on PAC, we've been looking into that, and it is a problem when you have not only it's the level of unaccountability that I think is the big problem in that. The Prime Minister said a few weeks ago, at the start of the summer, in his Levelling Up speech, that he wanted to see that county devolution. I think it's really important that the towns of the north of England, and actually in the south of England as well, get that reach that the major metropolitan areas now have. I think that's going to be fundamental, because if you're going to level up communities like mine, then you're going to have people committed to those areas, really driving them forwards, and seeing this holistically between that link between infrastructure, public services, and good careers in order to enable communities like mine to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I like the ambition of the next 20 to 30 years. That's a good way for us to kick off our discussion. Margaret.
Great. So I wanted to pick up on something that James said about the importance of the local. But from our perspective, we'd like the focus to be on the hyper-local or neighbourhoods. And we'd actually argue that we need to tackle economic inequality neighbourhood by neighbourhood, starting first with the neighbourhoods that are most deprived or most left behind. And we need to tackle it in a way that shifts power into the hands of local residents, building their confidence, capacity and skills, because we think that that's the only way in which the positive change achieved can be sustained. So to illustrate what's possible, I'd like to tell you about Lawrence Weston, which is a post-war housing estate in North Bristol, and how the residents on that estate have been working together to improve their area. So unemployment on the estate is significantly above the national average, and its location right on the edge of the city and poor transport means that the people that live there often feel quite cut off or forgotten. By around sort of 2010, 2011, the estate had lost most of its community facilities. And at the point that the local FE college was shut, residents actually decided enough was enough. And a small group of them actually came together to work out how they could bring services and facilities back to their estate. Now, the first thing that they did was they applied for a small government grant and were successful to develop a community economic development plan. And then as soon as they completed that, they heard that they'd been awarded £1 million from lottery funds through the Big Local programme. And Big Local is something that my organisation, a programme that my organisation, Local Trust, administers. So that £1 million enabled them to start to implement their community economic development plan. Now, I think what's the first thing to say is the Big Local funding, they would say, was incredibly important to them. And the reason it was important was it's unrestricted funding, so the community can use it to achieve its own priorities. You know, it's not restricted or tied. The other thing was that it's long-term funding, so they had 10 to 15 years to spend it. The other crucial thing is that it comes with capacity building support. So that's all the background, but the exciting bit is what they've actually managed to achieve. So far, based on market research that they supported with their big lottery money, they've persuaded a low-cost supermarket to come to the estate. That's generated jobs for local people. It's also provided access to cheap food. They've also supported and developed a number of services and facilities to meet local needs. So, for example, they're doing lots of work to tackle unemployment, to link people to jobs. They're addressing health issues on the estate, particularly mental health issues and loneliness and isolation. And they've brought millions of pounds of investment into that area. So, for example, they're working with the local authority and the health authority on a 1.8 million health and community hub. They've developed new high-quality passive housing on the estate. They have their own solar farm, and they've secured planning permission for a community-owned wind turbine. That's set to be the largest in England. Now, one thing that's exciting about all of that is they're managing to generate quite a lot of income to support their community activities. And their aspiration is that, you know, they will become independent by that means. You know, they won't need to apply for charitable funding. So what does that show us? So I would argue that what that shows us is that with relatively small scale patient investment, so in the case of Lawrence Weston, it's £10 per head of population per annum, added to the significant volunteer time that local residents are able to, or you know, are passionate enough to contribute, we can lay the foundations to transform some of the most deprived or left behind areas. Now that's just the story of one big local area that in my view sets out the case for community level investment. But there's also an increasing body of data research and analysis that supports that case. So, for example, a recent report by the think tank Onward on community regeneration found that the New Deal for Community areas that improved most were those that had a solid base of social infrastructure. So that is, the community, facilities, organisations, and activities that make for a strong local community. And those were also the areas actually that had the most sort of sustained impact. So just to be clear, we're not suggesting that other types of investment, such as on transport infrastructure, skills development, innovation, aren't important. We think they are, but what we're arguing is that they're also, that attention also needs to be given to this community element, or this sort of social infrastructure and the development of local assets element, because it can make such an enormous difference to people's lives, and it can sow the seeds of local economic development. So finally, we've developed a proposal around a community wealth fund. And our idea is that fund could support the development of community-led social infrastructure, along the model I'm suggesting, in the most deprived or left behind areas. Now, there are a number of potential sources that could support that fund. So Onward, for example, have suggested that there could be a top slice of levelling up funds for community regeneration. But our proposal, and it's a proposal supported by over 440 civil society, public and private sector organisations, is that fund receives dormant assets. And obviously an attraction of that is that the fund could be established and delivered without putting further pressure on mainstream government budgets.
Brilliant, thank you, Margaret. It's inspiring to hear about the Bristol example. And then finally, Martin.
Thanks very much. I'm 2 months into my role as Chief Executive of Transport for the North, and the first couple of months has been spent meeting many of the TfN board members and partners. And the things that keep coming back time and time again are a sense of ambition for the North, a sense of commitment to making it better, and a real aspiration to cut through and get into delivery. And overriding all of that is a real sense that a deep-held belief that if you didn't have Transport for the North, you'd create it, because it's important that the leaders of the North have the ability to shape the future moving forward. Now, when it comes to levelling up, what that means to me is we've got to do things differently. Because if we don't do things differently, we're just going to end up with where we are at the moment. And by, I think, common consent, we need to do things differently and have a different outcome. Others have already made the comment about the fact that that is partly about using the funding that is currently available in a different way. If you think about the cost of administering all those individual funds that James touched on, it's a level of overhead which, if you were in the private sector, you wouldn't accept. And yet we in the public sector do accept it. And so there must be ways of actually reducing that cost and reminding ourselves that if you reduce that inertia, you're actually probably freeing up revenue investment, which is one of the hardest sources of funding for the public sector at the moment. It is also about focusing on outcomes, and it's about delivering in terms of social and environment and health and well-being. And one of the things that we're doing as Transport for the North moving forward is we're looking at the outputs and the outcomes of our investment pipeline in the round, so that you don't start trying to justify each and every scheme on its own merits, but you think about how it contributes to an overall picture, and then make sure that that overall picture is delivering on your outcomes that you're seeking. This is also for me about putting the user at the heart of all that we do. my observations about the pandemic is, in many ways, it accelerated trends that were already well underway before the pandemic. If you think about the use of e-services, e-commerce, about doing things remotely, those trends were already underway. And what we've seen in the pandemic is them being accelerated. Now, there are implications for what we do in terms of transport and wider infrastructure. But what it also reminded me is that we can actually change some of these things a lot faster than we've told ourselves is possible in the past. We're very good at telling ourselves it's going to take 5 or 10 or 15 years. Do you know what? If you want to achieve some change, if you're clear about what change you're looking to achieve, you can actually deliver it a lot faster. But in all of that, we need to be careful that we're being mindful of the much broader requirement to have our solutions that reflect the diversity of our communities. I still see too many transport solutions which assume that every single person behaves in exactly the same way, irrespective of their background, their age, their culture, their ethnicity. And in truth, we know that these are all factors and many others which have implications. So we've got to start thinking in terms of how we connect people and places, services and opportunities. We've got to think about how we want to repurpose our towns and our cities to actually be a focus for different things in the future. And we need to have the tools that allow us to do that. And that's why we've been investing time and money over the years to develop an analytical framework that allows us to look across modes and increasingly to look at what the implications for the land values and the land use will be of investment in major infrastructure. So we know that when we're talking about the benefits of Northern Powerhouse Rail for Liverpool Lime Street, for Piccadilly, for Bradford, for Leeds, for the other cities, we know what the implications will be for the land use around it. And going back to comments from others, it allows us to help repurpose those towns and cities so that people can realise their potential from where they live rather than having to move away. We haven't touched so far about decarbonisation. I mean, this is both an economic opportunity and an environmental necessity. But we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful that it's not a divisive policy, because there are large parts of our communities, particularly those in rural areas, for whom there are few alternatives to what we currently have. Doesn't mean to say we can't pursue them and look for alternatives, but we must make sure we don't inadvertently disadvantage parts of our society. Goes back to the point I made earlier about we need to be respectful of the diversity of our communities that we're serving. Now, what all this tells me, going back about the need to do things differently, is it's really important that you have the right people in the room taking those decisions. And it's why, as Transport for the North, we're clear that the best people to take difficult decisions about how to do things differently are the leaders of the North. They are the ones that set the plan. They've set out a vision which is evidence-based. They've published it in the Strategic Transport Plan. And 2 weeks ago, we published the Northern Transport Charter, which set out our offer to government about how we could work together to deliver that transport plan by doing things differently, by putting the user at the heart of our work, by having an investment pipeline that we use funding to develop to the point where we're ready to deliver. But we do it within a financial framework which is responsible. So understanding how much is available and making those difficult choices to deliver it with one voice. Now that, for us, as the North, is the devolution agenda, and that, for us, through Transport for the North, is how we're going to deliver a new North.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. So we're now going to open up the discussion to questions, and there is a roving mic that Lara can bring round. I also have my own if people need a bit more time to think, but do we have any questions right now? Brilliant. So I've got one here and then one here.
Hiya. George, you spoke about some structural issues with the economy and why we've ended up in such an unequal position. I'd be really interested to know, how do you think, for the whole panel, we really break some of those things so we don't just end up bringing up areas while others go into decline over this period of sort of 20 to 30 years? How do we really break this cycle for the long term rather than just fixing the places that need investment now and being in the same position sort of 20 years' time with different areas?
And a question at the front.
think that one probably deserves quite a lot of time in itself. But I wanted to ask, it actually just ties into some of what James was saying, and also just ties into some work we've done in Durham. So I'm Devon, I'm the Director of Policy and Practice. We do a lot of work with local authorities on identifying individuals that are struggling in local areas. And one of the biggest challenges we see, I absolutely agree with James, local authorities are really well placed to make better use of public money. What I find is really challenging for them, because they're so stretched, so much more stretched than they have been in the past, they've lost some of the bandwidth they need to then put their excellent skills, knowledge and expertise into effect. And that kind of the investment that goes in changing and remaining effective and remaining relevant. And I just wondered about the panel's views on maintaining that ability to make a bigger difference locally.
Brilliant, thank you. And I might just expand that first question just to make it even bigger. But I think it's a really important one because, you know, at this conference so far we've heard about a broken economic model and how that needs to change. We're talking today about the same thing. A lot of the kind of answers when we think about levelling up are within the same set of topics that we've been talking about for some time. So, you know, whether it's jobs, skills, investment, what is different about the levelling up agenda, what's distinctive, and what is that answer to the question of how do you fix a broken economic model? Or if you don't think those answers are there yet, what should they be? George, I'm going to kick off with you for those two.
Okay, I don't claim to have the answer to that in the whole question, because I think it is a massive one. I think, first of all, the case that we would be making around levelling up, and I guess the power of the phrase itself, is that it's around raising other places up to the same level of the best in the country, rather than trying to reduce or push down the tallest poppies. I think, first of all, there is the funding question. So London does receive a huge amount more per capita investment in a whole range of different things, and I think raising that investment up across the UK through a fair and transparent funding formula, which allows people to understand how much funding and investment they will receive in their region, to allow those places to grow. Second of all, grow to do what? And I think that means that you need a kind of nuanced understanding of what each place's economic model is going to be. So I don't think we're trying to advocate every city to become London. It's around trying to understand what the local strengths of places are. To take an example of that, thinking about Sheffield, Rotherham region, there's most people say that we don't make anything in the UK anymore, but there's a centre there called the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, which is built on the strengths of the local supply chains of high-value manufacturing firms in Sheffield in the steel industry, and it builds on the best of the academic expertise at the University of Sheffield. Policymakers in Westminster did not know that those latent capabilities existed, but local policymakers in the RDA, the Regional Development Agency, 20 years ago did. And today, with the help of that the AMRC, the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, Boeing has made a hundreds of millions of pounds investment, and is now manufacturing components in Sheffield, which were previously manufactured in Mexico, and they're doing it at a cheaper rate in the UK. The reason that exists is because local policymakers were able to understand the strengths of their place and to build a vision of the local economy that should exist in that place. So it's about trying to understand the different capabilities and different economies that exist across the UK. And again, looking backwards through the pandemic, some of the worst effects have been in coastal communities because they have economies which are predominantly dependent upon the hospitality sector, whilst also being economically deprived. So trying to understand the different forms of economy and economic development that we want across the country. And I was going to make a third point, which has escaped me, so I'll turn to my fellow panelists.
Sticking with the question on that cycle of kind of economic decline and growth, Richard, could I turn to you for your thoughts on that one?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yes. I think there has been this cycle is something that I think is almost ingrained in the psyche of some of the communities, certainly the ones that I represent. It almost feels that for some of the communities, it's almost that place almost symbolises decline. I certainly think particularly of Concert in my constituency, which I think the town almost has imbued that into itself, that's part of who it is. But like you might consider parts of the Rust Belt so-called Rust Belt in America. I don't actually think that doesn't actually reflect a lot of what's going on in some of these places, though, which is the flip side to it. And I think in a way, you know, I think this is an opportunity to not just to break that place's idea of itself. I think that's almost what we're trying to do with levelling up, is the entire idea of these places and the idea that you need to move away, or the identity of the place. And I think that what the point that's just been made is incredibly important, which is about levelling up. It is not about rebalancing, and this is something which I think the phrasing is really important here. It's not about taking stuff away from somewhere and giving it to somewhere else. My communities do not want to see worse bus services or train services elsewhere in the country. What they want to see is their area have a fair crack of the whip, essentially, in terms of the services which are available to them in their locality. So I think that's a sort of slightly fundamental, and that's an important part of that argument when we're talking about it. That cycle of the cycle though is the concern, because that's as I was referencing in terms of public services, that cycle replays itself in so many different ways. It plays itself in mental health outcomes in County Durham. It plays itself out in those educational outcomes, and I think that's part of what that's essentially what we're trying to tackle, that cycle of the place not being somewhere that people want to be, and and being in a permanent state of not decline so much as of being subsidised to exist in its current state, and lifting it beyond that. And I know that sounds a bit vague and woolly, but that's why the building back better element of it is so important. And I just wanted to say one thing about that cycle. I think one of the cycles that I think the government has successfully broken over the last 10 years, or has moved towards in a significantly positive way, is of pensioner poverty. And I think one of the things that was really improved over that decade is that auto-enrolment of pensions. I think that's widely accepted across the piece as a positive thing. I think one of the things that I and some of my colleagues currently, particularly from seats like mine, are pushing for now is the extension of that auto-enrolment to 18 plus rather than 22 plus, because actually 70% of my constituents start work or enter the employment market at 18. They don't go on to university. And also to reduce the age, the amount at which you've got to earn before that auto-enrolment kicks in, from, I think it's around 7,500 to 0. That would mean for a woman in my constituency, and it's usually women who work part-time, at the moment, they would end up with a retirement pension pot in today's money of around 66 grand. If you removed the floor and you started at 18, she'd end up with a pension pot in today's money of 200 grand. That would fundamentally change how she saw her retirement in decades to come. And I think some of those changes are what we need to see. Some of those are structural, in terms of those big things we were talking about earlier on, in terms of trying to change public services, infrastructure and access to jobs. But some of them are also particularly acute in areas like mine. And just to make my final point, I think there's this talk of sort of red wall seats and things like that. Actually, there are similar. It's just that there are more of those types of voters in my constituency than there are in some other parts of the country. Similar in coastal towns, there are those pockets. You know, go to Sevenoaks, go to Swanley. You'll see those communities are in a similar place there. But I think that's where we've got to target on those people who really. And I think it's the people who feel that they're sort of trapped. And that imbues itself into the community. But I think we can make some serious breaks there. But I think part of it's those national policies as well as really giving pride in those places and giving accessibility to opportunities for people in those areas as well.
Thank you very much. James, you may have thoughts on that question. I also wondered if you could answer the one about bandwidth and local government.
Yes, so I'll do bandwidth and then I'll comment on the other one. So I think there is an issue of bandwidth, and it's exacerbated by government then expecting all sorts of things extra from us, like bidding for these zillions of different things. I mean, you know, and we end up paying for consultants. So the first thing I would say is reduce the demand on our bandwidth by basically having one pot. Would be really nice, and where that pot is based on what will you achieve, not how good is your bidding process, would be hugely helpful. But also in terms of a whole load of other things, we keep being asked for targets. We're still asked to do stupid things. You know, we have to publish in the Bedford Gazette, if you know Bedfordshire, which has a circulation of about 30, every planning inquiry. Our e-newsletter in Central Beds goes to 50% of our residents. We can't use that because that meets 50% of our residents. We have to use the one that has about a circulation of 30. So there's quite a few things that you could do that would make our life simpler. And I have a long list that I won't go through today, but I have shared with people in another place. So I think that's very important. Secondly is if you do start devolving stuff to us, because we just are better at it, says he, you know, that would create more resource because we'd be able to deliver. Now, we couldn't take it all on tomorrow, but I don't think that's a problem we're going to have because we're not going to be given it all tomorrow. But if we could have some more, we could certainly deliver. On the other one, and it was great, I felt at home. So my grandfather worked at the chemical works in Concert, and I went to Sheffield University, and they actually started the advanced materials manufacturing, as it was called then, when I was still at university there. You know, a couple of things that I would say is if you do this on a slightly more local basis, you will build on the strength of the area. If you are sort of levelling up from central government, you tend to sort of stick a big factory somewhere, you know, with lots of subsidies, and it isn't necessarily embedded in the local economy, and in 20 years' time, the world will have changed, and you won't really have embedded in the local economy, it will move. Now, frankly, that's worked for Nissan as far as I can tell. Nissan has created a network of feeder plants and other things, but I can tell you that there are other factories that have been planted in places which, you know, once they went to the new model or something was cheaper to build in Hungary, they just shifted. So you really need to build on that local embedded knowledge, and you're absolutely right. Sheffield has got a lot of embedded knowledge in metallurgy and metals. You know, okay, this isn't the north, but in Biggleswade, which is in my patch, a huge amount of knowledge around technical and tool making and things. And if you go to the northeast, huge about steel, about chemicals. There are things you can embed on, and you can use that local skill base and that local knowledge and build on and create something that it won't exactly be organic, but it has roots, and it will be able to multiply and create more businesses. And I think that's really important. And it does actually relate to the comment earlier about communities. We also need great places to live, because not only are you trying to keep people to live where they are, you're actually trying to attract some key people to help support these businesses. So if you've got a great place to live and it's a great community, and how can we build those communities, you're going to be a great place to live, which means people want to live there, which means a lot of companies are looking for where can I get hold of good workers at a reasonable price. And actually it could be the northeast. And at the moment all those good workers unfortunately travel south. How do we keep them there, and how do we encourage some of those people based in London or Leeds to move to the northeast? How do we encourage people who are based in Liverpool to not leave Liverpool but stay there and help build businesses in Liverpool? And that's about great communities, and it's about having businesses that have roots, or at least can develop roots in the local area.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Margaret and Martin if they'd like to comment on these questions. Martin.
So the question was about the structural issues, and I'm on my third incarnation of regional structures in my professional career, which tells me that actually we know we need something at a regional level for certain things. The way I've often described the added value of regional partnerships are there are some pieces of infrastructure, of which Northern Powerhouse Rail is the obvious example in our region, which you have to work together on to actually deliver. In my previous role, James, it was obviously East-West Rail, a project that's close to my heart as well. So there's a need to come together to work across boundaries. There's also added value of working together on the same issue, which hits and affects all partners in the same way. And you can get added value from actually doing things in a collective way. And then there's the added value of having one voice. Now, kind of building on why that kind of is important, and if thinking about what needs to happen at what level. So I think it's great that the government has led the way in terms of regulation around phasing out of internal combustion engines and diesel engines, because only government can do that. But once it's done it, we've seen the private sector, the automotive manufacturers, responding very quickly to that changed rules and actually delivering quite substantial change. So whereas the target is to have those vehicles by sort of sometime in the 2030s, you know, I think you'll see it a lot faster in terms of new vehicles, because that's the way the market has reacted. But only government could make that change in the regulation. Then if I think about things like, let's take another example that's relevant for us about how we deal with the opportunities presented by William Shapp's rail review. Now, it's clear that the metro mayors will want to have a relationship with Great British Railways, because they will want to integrate local rail services with their other local transport. But equally, I've sat in meetings of our Rail North Committee where it's been very clear that they understand that to deliver the joined-up approach across the north, they need to work together. They need to work together in terms of transport for the north. And this is where, going back to the question about structural issues, we still see at a national level too many silos within departments, let alone silos between departments. And for me, it has always been the case that you can look across subjects and look at things in a systems approach if you start doing it at a regional level, because that kind of is a scale at which you can actually make some sense of this. And I think there's a bit of hope as well in terms of the support for local partners, because increasingly in the conversations I have, my partners understand I've got a model that will look at the whole of the road network. I've got a model that will look at the whole of the rail network. I've got a model that will join those two up. I've got a model that will join that with the land use. And the fact of the matter is, we've spent time and money developing that, and people can have access to it if they're a partner, because it's public money investing in something which is a public asset. Now, the benefit there is you immediately have a common, consistent starting point for all your conversations. You actually have you're further down the route in making the case for strategic business cases, and they are consistent. And that actually allows you to make some progress in terms of delivery. So increasingly, we're seeing recognition from within the Department for Transport that actually the specialist knowledge and capacity which exists within TfN and the other STBs is actually something valuable and something worth holding on to. And by the way, we used to have it in terms of regional data observatories and regional planning documents. And so I come back to that point. This is the third incarnation I've been on at regional level. Tells me that we kind of know we do need it for certain things, supporting and complementing the individual partners working within those partnerships.
Thanks very much, Martin. And Margaret.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on the point about the role of local authorities and local authorities being extremely stretched. And that's on the basis that we're starting to have really interesting conversations with a number of local authorities who are struggling to manage demand for their services. So they're looking to develop a new role, which is more sort of enabling or facilitative, and therefore they're interested in working with their local communities to co-produce services, or they're interested in devolving budgets to local communities so they can deliver, some of the council's responsibilities as appropriate. So I think, that's really interesting to us, obviously. Could we have a new model of local government where, the democracy wasn't just through the ballot box, but it was also through much greater involvement of residents in delivering, the services and facilities that are really important to them and that they need.
Thanks, Margaret. I have lots of follow-ups to that, but we'll have to pick it up after the event because I want to get some more questions in. Any questions from the floor? One at the back there.
So there was mention made of the example of the reunification of Germany, and over the last 30 years, huge sums of money have been spent there. and yet 30 years on, Eastern Germany is still poorer. We see in the recent federal election, it's still, I think probably quite importantly, much angrier than the rest of the country. How do we avoid that issue with levelling up? How do we make sure that how do we learn the lessons from Germany and not face the same problems in 30 years?
I don't think any of you are 20th century historians, are you? But George, given you commented on the unification point, do you want to start?
Yeah, I definitely set myself up for that. I'm a bit sceptical about whether that's something that we need to avoid, because I think we're already there. Some of the figures in the report show that levels of, there's survey data on, do people feel that the government cares about them? And the levels of anger outside the southeast in terms of does the government care about you or in the UK are already extremely high. So I think we're already there. I think part of the reason why we need to worry about levelling up so much is because there are quite big disparities in terms of whether people feel that central government does care. Arguably some of the power of phrases like take back control are because they do speak to people's their feelings they don't have control over the government and doesn't speak for them. And on the question of kind of whether East Germany is poorer than West Germany, the reason why the unification of Germany is such a good example is that 30 years ago, at unification, the economic disparity between East and West Germany was significantly larger than the economic disparity in the UK at the time. But the gap has narrowed and it's now smaller. So the split between East and West Germany is significantly smaller now than between North and South England. So I think that, I don't think the model's totally transferable, but I think there are things that we should learn from there rather than fear.
Can I just, we did, as part of the work for our transport conference, which we had a couple of weeks ago, we undertook some polling of residents in the north. And it was really interesting, to see how, compared with the start of the year, northern residents are more optimistic now than they were, which is great, and that's really encouraging. And if you look at, I don't know what it's like in the London rail terminal, but every time I go out on the rail in the north, we're back to pretty near what the pre-COVID levels were. So it's come back and quickly. But what was also interesting was that their confidence about the longer term, the sort of 10 years out, was actually less. And I think that reflects their sort of the uncertainty that still hangs around the moment, some of the more significant transformative investment like Northern Powerhouse Rail and HS2. And I think the message that gives me is we don't expect all of those projects to be delivered in the next 2 or 3 years. But if there is a plan, if there is a sense of purpose, if there is a sense of commitment from government that there is a need to invest in a region for a medium to long term, and there is a plan which we're working within, that then feeds into the confidence of the communities, it feeds into the confidence of the businesses. And I think that's then where you start to address that concern at the moment. Now, one of the things we're hoping for when we see the integrated rail plan land, hopefully in the next week or so, is we'll obviously get some sense of where the government's head is in terms of those two major infrastructure. But if we get that kind of long-term acknowledgement by Treasury that once they start investing in this, they need to continue, I think that's a really powerful signal that then people can work with, both people within the political world and also within the business community.
Thank you. We've touched on and skirted around a little bit this question of how people feel about their areas and how they feel about their economy. Michael Gove today said that levelling up should be about restoring dignity to people and places. For my next kind of impossible to answer question, how do you do that? What is the key ingredient to restoring dignity to people? Richard, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Well, I just wanted to address the East Germany issue at the moment. I mean, the problem in East Germany was probably had a government that cared a little bit too much before reunification. You know, the Stasi wanted to know everything about you. I think the key thing, I think in Germany, I'm not sure about the lessons and the crossovers there. You were looking at a society which was fundamentally different, and I think you're looking at real culture, a cultural divide, particularly in Saxony, which seems to have maintained, which with the rise of AFD, and I don't quite see the same parallels in a lot of ways. But to come back onto Michael Gove's point, which I think is something which you possibly can see some parallels between, is that element of dignity for both of those places and those communities. I think the greatest way you can really restore that is to, if you look at a community like Northwest Durham, like Consett, a place which has had things taken away from it over a very long period of time, since the end of the Second World War. It used to have 3 railway lines, now it's got none. It used to have a major local employer which was seen as not just a local symbol of pride, but a regional and even national symbol at certain times of pride, certainly with major historic significance. I think the way to really drive that dignity element, that sense of pride in place, is also on a fundamental level, so that you don't feel that your kids have to leave in order to get on. If you can get to that position, then that's going to, and also not just that they don't have to leave, but people also are happy to move to your area. There'll be a bit of movement back and forth, but that your area is not somewhere that's permanently exporting talent to other parts of the country. I think that's what's the key driver is, and that, as I said, earlier on, I think it comes in that connectivity to other parts of the country, so that people can live there and do good jobs, and public services which aren't constantly, trying to fight to maintain talent, and that all comes down to people feeling that there are good jobs and there are prospects there. I think that's where local pride and local dignity comes from, and that that local talent can be rewarded and can flourish locally. So I think that sort of government as a catalyst for those things, and that sense of place is really important, what we want to see.
Thank you. James?
I think we're going to have unanimity on this panel here, unfortunately. We don't have any fisticuffs, but never mind. That's because we're a Conservative conference. I think this thing is about a great place to live and work, and somewhere that you enjoy living and you're not depressed. And that varies. People have different priorities. That's about having a good school that your children can go to. It's about having a job. I mean, statistically, having a job, even if it's a bad job, is the thing that makes you happier, gives you better health outcomes than anything else. So it's about employment, it's about schools, it's about the environment. It is about community resilience. It's about feeling that you are involved in some of the decision making in your place, whether that's on planning, whether that's about, what your local park looks like. And it's all, I would say a lot of it's hyper-local. It genuinely is. And it's how do we do those things effectively that I think really matters. And that's where you get pride in your place. And pride in your place also is involved where you have not only a stake in it, but you are part of that place. You're not being done to, you are doing.
Thank you. Margaret, did you want to comment on this one?
Well, I think again, I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, I think the only thing that I'd add is, from our perspective in deprived areas, it is very much about giving people a say in their area and how it might be improved, and recognising that they've got skills and capabilities, that they're capable of great innovation, seeing them as assets, when quite often in the past they may have been perceived as problems, or that the area is perceived as a problem area.
Thank you. Are there any final questions before I ask my closing question of our panel? One over here.
Hi there. I'm Graham. I'm here with the charity Groundwork that does a lot of projects with local communities about pride of place and about improving people's prospects in local areas. And maybe it would be a good final question, this. Listening to Michael Gove, listening to all the discussions about levelling up, I'm slightly concerned that it means everything. People have been trying to understand, what does it mean? Well, it seems to now mean everything. Curing all of society's ills. We don't have £2 trillion. That's not going to make it happen. So we do have to bend the money that already exists, spend the money that's currently being spent better. So where would you start? Which budgets would you bend? Which bits of expenditure would you focus into those areas in order to start getting that decency back?
And you've done me a big favour by asking my question much more eloquently, so thank you for that. My question was going to be, what do you want to see prioritised in the Levelling Up white paper coming up? And yeah, I think you're exactly right with that comment of there has been criticism of levelling up so far that it can mean everything to everyone. So how can we prioritise? I'll go down the table this way, starting with Martin.
So the thing that I would want it to prioritise is devolution and actually then deliver it and empower local leaders working either at a regional level or within their own communities to be able to allocate and use the funding that's available to deliver the outcomes that are best for their communities. I think that's the most important thing for me.
Thanks, Martin. Margaret?
Yeah, so I think for us it would be about a recognition of how important the social is, and community and community connections, because that's not irrelevant in terms of the economy. We all know how important social capital is to a sort of functioning economy. So I'd argue for that.
Thanks very much. Richard?
A couple of things. If we're going to prioritise anything in transport, I want local buses which are inexpensive to use and can run so that young people and people on relatively low incomes can get to both education and employment opportunities in their wider area than just what's literally on their street or in their small town or village. I want to see FE prioritised so that it's there is a real ladder up there, and we're not constantly forcing people away to options which may be either not suitable for them, but that FE is tied into the local communities, because I've seen far too many good FE provision in the good local areas go to the wall and with HE prioritised. And I think finally, the thing I'd also like to see to really boost some of the local communities, one of the things I haven't got in my two largest towns in my constituency is a town or parish council. I know that might sound like something which is really small, but actually for Concert and for Crook in my area, having a parish council or a town council for those areas, rather than everything being a large unitary council, would actually make a real difference and also be helpful for me to deal with as a local MP in order to leverage government support into the area.
Thanks very much. James?
I'm going to agree with everyone again. But devolution, I think, is the way to square the circle. Allow local decision making on things, and it's not just infrastructure. It is DWP, it's FE colleges, it's a whole range of things, and that would actually allow at a local level for you then to pass on more to the micro level. So I think that is the absolute crucial thing. And devolution in planning as well. Allow local communities to decide what is right for their communities.
Thanks very much. And George?
I mean, in my opening remarks, I already said the two things which I think are most important, which are devolution and investment, so I'd very much agree with the other panellists. But I think you were asking the more tricky question of how will we know we've achieved levelling up? And I think that the three things I would pick would be transport. Absolutely agree with Richard's point. I live in London now, where you can travel from one side of the city to the other for less than £2, but I'm originally from Wakefield, and it's about a 10-minute drive across Wakefield, and you can't do that for £2. I think health, the most glaring inequality of all, is the difference in life expectancy as you go down the East Coast main line. I think it's a scandal. And I'd say educational attainment and skills as well. Those has to be the three priorities.
Great, so I think we've got about 7 priorities, but some clear themes, including devolution, looking beyond infrastructure investment of that devolution, transport, skills and education, and something about democracy and thinking about the community and hyperlocal as well as local authorities. So we'll draw to a close there, and it just falls to me to say thank you to all of you for coming along and for excellent questions and contributions, and a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. And I hope you have a great conference.
Thanks very much.